Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for tuning in to this week's session of Family Affairs Monday. We are College of Marriage, Parenting, and Family Affairs. And we really, our heart is to help you enrich your family relationships and enjoy your family life. And so in line with that, we do videos every Monday talking about issues that affect families and family relationships. And we've been doing a series on conflict the last few weeks. And so you can check out our other videos. If you haven't seen them yet, you can check those out on conflict. And so we've covered, what's conflict, and we've talked about how as long as you're in relationships and, even in family, conflict will happen. There is no way around it. And we talked about how it's how you handle the conflict that matters. And we also talked about the different types of conflict. We talked about how unresolved conflict affects relationships and the signals that tell you that there is probably an unresolved conflict within the family. And we looked in last week's video at the 6-stage process of resolving conflict and the practical tips that you can use when you're resolving conflict. And so this week's session, we're going to talk about the 5 modes that you can use in resolving conflicts. And so this is a model developed by Thomas Kilman. So these are 2 guys who developed this model about the type of modes that you can use when you're trying to resolve conflict. And I found these so applicable even in family life. And so I'll just start by saying, in conflict, you have 2 goals that you're trying to achieve. And so whenever there's a conflict within the family or within a relationship, what you're trying to do is, number 1, you are trying to solve the problem. You're trying to solve the issue, or you're trying to address an agenda or a need that you have. That's the first one. And then the second one is, in addressing this, you are also trying to preserve the relationship. And so you want to make sure that as you are resolving your conflict, you do it in such a way that the relationship remains intact or even grows stronger through the conflict. And so just as we go further, just keep those in mind, those 2 goals that you have in terms of addressing conflict. So the first one is you want to solve the issue, you want to address the problem, and then the second one is you want to maintain the relationship. So let's get into it. Different modes of addressing conflict. So the first mode that I'm going to talk about is avoiding. We all know this one, don't we? So the first mode when you're dealing with conflict is avoiding. Now with avoiding, your goal is to delay the conflict. And so instead of facing it, you're actually trying to delay the showdown, as it were. And so what this looks like is you withdraw or you maintain neutrality. And so these are those cases where, say your children are arguing and you don't pick a side. So you avoid the conflict, you maintain neutrality, and that's what that looks like. And, with all these modes that we'll be talking about, there are advantages, there are disadvantages, and the important thing is to realize which one is your default so that you know when it's appropriate and when to borrow from other types of modes. And so generally each person has a default mode that they stick to, but you need to know when your method is effective and when it's not, and when to avoid it. And so avoiding can be effective. There's situations where avoiding is actually a good way of dealing with conflict. And so an example is when you want to delay the conflict and wait for a better time. And so you're in a supermarket and you and your spouse don't agree about something, or something comes up. Now that setting might not be the most appropriate for you to go at it. And so you can actually avoid the conflict. You can maintain neutrality, or you can withdraw from the conflict in order to address it at a later, more appropriate time. And if you watched last week's video, you'll remember that Mr. Gezana talked about, HATS, or hats, when it's not appropriate to address conflict. And he talked about, don't address conflict when you're hungry, when you're angry, when you're tired, or when you're stressed about something. And so there are times where it's appropriate for you to actually delay the showdown and delay the conflict until a later, more appropriate time. And so it might also look like diplomatic sidestepping, so someone might directly address you. So, Dad, what do you think? Or Dad, what's your opinion? Mom, what do we do? And you actually find, diplomatic ways of sidestepping or avoiding. And so you withdraw from the situation until such a time as you can address it. But it's important to realize realize that you cannot always use this mode. There are times where if used in excess, what you're actually now doing is you're just sweeping things under the carpet. And I like this saying, the bill always comes due. And so you might sweep things under the carpet, but you got to realize that these conflicts need to be addressed at some point. And so if you don't address them, you actually have to come back to them at some point. So don't avoid and keep delaying until the conflict begins to affect the relationship. The second mode of dealing with conflict is called accommodating. And if you remember our two goals when we're facing a conflict, to solve the problem and to preserve the relationship. Now with accommodating, it's very high on preserving the relationship. And so you're working really hard to make sure that, peace is maintained and the relationship is good, but it's very low on problem solving. And so what you end up doing is you give in. And so whatever the other party is saying, you give in, and sometimes your needs don't get addressed and the problem doesn't get addressed. But you do maintain the relationship because you don't shake the boat. And so you maintain harmony and you're reluctant to stand up for your own needs. And that's what this looks like. It looks like giving in. It looks like rolling over, if I can put it that way. And this is okay. There are times where it's good to accommodate. And so I like to use the phrase picking your battles. And so you need to learn to pick your battles. Not everything is worth fighting for, all guns blazing. So you assess, you see the stakes. Is it a high stakes issue? Is it a low stakes issue? I like to talk about open-handed versus closed-handed issues. Is it something that you need to fight for? If not, then there's nothing wrong with rolling over and letting the other person win it. And so you're talking with your spouse about which route is the best to get to a certain place. So they're driving, you're in the passenger seat, and you have a preferred route to get to where you're going, and they have a different one. Is that worth fighting over? Is it worth a full-on battle? Probably not. And so sometimes it's good to just let them win one, let them get that one. And so you let them win. But it's important not to overdo this, because sometimes you need to place boundaries. Sometimes you need to stand up for your own needs so that you don't end up in a situation where you're prone to abuse. And so you also need to guard against people pleasing with this mode of conflict resolution. And so you can't always use this one, because it then becomes people pleasing. You're giving into anything that anyone else says. And so you need to then realize, I like what Eve Ensler says, there's a difference between pleasing and loving. There's a difference between obeying and respecting. And so it's very possible for you to love someone and not please them. So you can love them, but still not give in to every single thing that they demand, when it's not something that you are able to do, when it crosses a boundary for you. And you can also respect someone without necessarily obeying what they are saying, because you have to strike that balance. And so it's important, if your default is accommodating, for you to know when it's appropriate and when it's not, and just guard against abuse there. But also, if you're very strong in, say, competing, which we'll talk about next, it's very good for you to begin to learn how to accommodate sometimes. And so how to give in the win, how to let someone else take it. And so it's okay to strike that balance and to learn that. The third conflict resolution mode that I want to talk about is called competing. And with competing, your goal is to win. I like to call this one the bulldozer mode. And so with competing, you are very high on solving the problem and getting the agenda met. You are very high on meeting your needs, but it's very low on maintaining the relationship. And so with competing, what you end up doing is you end up using whatever power is available to you to get what you want. And so you are looking for a win-lose solution. And so you are looking to win, the other person will lose, and you focus on your needs, your agenda, and the outcomes that you want. And so it looks like sometimes pursuing your own beliefs or your gains at another person's expense. It looks like using whatever power is necessary, like I mentioned before, to win, and throwing your weight around. And sometimes it can be being aggressive about your own needs, and that's competing. And in excess, I'm sure just talking about it, you can see that in excess, this would actually be a form of abuse and control in relationships. And so if you're in a relationship with someone who is consistently pushing their own agenda at your expense and consistently refusing to look at your viewpoint, and you might need to realize that this is now control and this is now abuse in its extreme. But this method can be good. There are situations where you might need to adopt this mode. And these are situations where there are high stakes, so about closed-handed issues. So I talked before about open-handed and closed-handed issues. There are things that you cannot afford to compromise on. And so, for example, I have a friend of mine who had an aunt who was ill and she was in hospital, and the doctors had made a diagnosis and they were about to start treatment. And then someone else in the family came in and said, we need to approach this another way. And so they wanted to take her out of hospital against medical advice and, look for help in religious circles. And so that became a conflict within the family about whether to discharge her, whether to keep her there, and the aunt was not able to make the decision herself. And so say, for example, you are the husband to that woman who is in hospital, cannot decide for herself, and family members now want to remove her against medical advice. You might need to then adopt competing mode where you do not compromise. And so you push and you use whatever is at your disposal. You use whatever weight you have to actually then win. And so you can even go legal if that's what it takes. And so that's an example of a situation where the stakes are high. And so you cannot afford to not win. So that's an example of when it's good to use the competing mode. But I like to say that even if you use the competing mode, it's always good to then follow up and try and restore the relationship afterwards, if possible. And so you've stepped on people's toes in order to make sure that something really important gets done. You can always then go back and then have a debrief and talk about it and try and make amends within the relationships and build bridges. And then conflict resolution mode number 4 is compromising. And this is one that people like to push. So in compromising, you try and find a solution where each person gives up something and the relationship is maintained. And there are times where this is good. You can, if you can't find a solution where everyone wins, then it's better sometimes to find a solution where everyone gives up a little bit and you meet somewhere in the middle ground. And then there's the conflict resolution mode number 5, which is collaborating. Now this one lets you find a win-win solution. Who doesn't want that? And so there are cases where you can actually work together to find a solution where everyone wins. And what this looks like is you sit down together and you tackle the problem or the issue together. And so it's almost like you and, say, your spouse are on one side and the problem, which may be, for example, finances. So you and your spouse are on one side and you're addressing the problem, which is how do we make our budget balance? And so because you are working together, you can actually be creative and expand the range of possible outcomes so that everyone wins, as opposed to looking at it as, wife, I want to buy my dress, and husband, I want to buy my Xbox or whatever. And so with this one, you stand together and you address the issue together to find a win-win solution. And the advantage of this is that you actually learn to work together. You dig into the issue and you can learn to identify each one's underlying concerns and underlying needs. So you actually get to understand each other better, So, for example, the husband might then say, I'm pushing for an Xbox because I'm so tired, I'm so stressed at work, and I just need something to decompress. And so as you attack the problem together, instead of attacking each other, you actually begin to be creative about your solutions and to actually get to know each other better. And so that is collaborating. Now, like I said before, with these conflict resolution modes, it's important to know, which one is your default so that you can guard against using it in situations where it's not appropriate, and also know the other ones so that you can borrow from each depending on the situation. So that's all I had on conflict resolution modes. We covered the 5, and I hope it was helpful. I hope you learned something about yourself and about the people that you are dealing with. And yeah, we'll pick up next week with another video on conflict. So see you then.